Hi, my name is Charlie Burton, and I'll be sharing with you my research titled The Short-Term Effects of Mindfulness Meditation on Psychological and Physiological Well-Being. Before starting, I'd just like to acknowledge that mindfulness and meditation practice do not originate in Western culture, but began in Hindu and Buddhist mindfulness traditions millennia ago, and that scientific thought and process are important, but shouldn't be conducted without recognizing the cultures and the people whose knowledge allow it to exist and progress today. My inspiration for this research comes from my own mental health journey over the past few years, and from a desire to know more about the ways in which the lives of the wider American population have been altered by the pandemic. Looking at the most recent iteration of surveys on anxiety in everyday life, from September to October 2021, the U.S. Census Bureau reports that 27% of Americans report symptoms of anxiety disorder in everyday life. Now, one of the most common anxiogenic thoughts is about time perception, specifically feeling like there's not enough time in the day to get done what you need to get done. However, a peer-reviewed analysis of the American Time Use Survey by Sturm and Cohen found that the average American has 5 or more hours of free time per day. Surely, this survey would be skewed lower if Ehrlamites were polled, but in light of this data, the question of, well, how are we spending our free time becomes significant. According to survey data provided by the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the majority of leisure time for Americans of all age ranges is spent online or watching television. A 2010 study by Hamer et al. Found that within tested samples, increased sedentary leisure time was associated with poor scores on mental health surveys. Now, there's ample research suggesting that more time should be spent outdoors or engaged in physical activity for better mental health, but an alternative that I would like to pose would be engaging in a kind of intentional sedentary time in meditation. To support this, a study conducted by Krieger et al. In 2013 found significantly increased well-being scores from participants who completed Vipassana training compared to the control group, with Vipassana being a type of mindfulness meditation. Definitionally, mindfulness meditation is a self-regulation strategy with a particular focus on training attention to breath or awareness, and on accepting oneself exactly as you are in a moment. To quote Jon Kabat-Zinn, a pioneer of mindfulness meditation as a Western scientific practice, mindfulness exists as an attempt to appreciate the deep mystery of being alive, and to acknowledge being vitally connected to all that exists. These definitions are conceptually useful, but let's build a physiological model that gives it significance as a potential tool for mental health improvement. Let's take a look at some of the underlying neurophysiology of meditation. An important aspect of meditation is posture and positioning. Many types of meditation, including body scan meditation, suggest resting on one's ischium, also known as the sit bones, with a straight back and relaxed shoulders. This allows increased diaphragm expansion, which thereby increases airflow into one's lungs. Deep breaths with an active focus on said breaths can introduce higher oxygen concentration into the bloodstream, and when increased saturation is recognized by endogenous homeostatic mechanisms, local regions in the hindbrain initiate signal propagation to organs, such as the heart. Action potentials propagate from preganglionic nerves to postganglionic ones, whose terminals end at the heart. When electrochemical signals make their way to the postganglionic axon terminal, acetylcholine release is stimulated, releasing the neurotransmitter into the postsynaptic space, where they bind to muscarinic receptors in the heart. Activated muscarinic receptors are inhibitory and therefore lower the heart rate until feedback loops halt the innervation process. This process, along with others in the parasympathetic activation pathway, allows for full body relaxation and relief of physical tension and stress that often begets or perpetuates anxiousness. In the brain, meditation has been seen to modulate brain waves, as recorded by electroencephalography, or EEG, equipment in study participants. Alpha and theta frequencies, which are frequency ranges that are associated with hypnagogic or relaxed states, are elevated during mindfulness. For questions about brainwave modulations, please post in the comment section, and I'd love to elaborate. With this new knowledge about mindfulness meditation, let's consult more literature. Most past studies on mindfulness meditation, such as the ones conducted by Krieger et al. And Davidson et al., have examined its effects in longer training formats, with benchmark tests being taken at the beginning and the end of weeks-long training camps or retreats. There does not seem to be an extensive study on the immediate effects of, say, a single meditation session on participants. In my research, I chose to apply the findings of the past literature to a temporal extreme in examining how soon can significant improvements in physiological or psychological well-being due to mindfulness meditation be seen. Particularly, can significant improvements in the well-being of a random sample be seen after just a single guided mindfulness meditation session? In this study, I had two primary hypotheses. My first hypothesis predicts that after a single body scan meditation session, participants will experience a significant increase in psychological well-being compared to the control group. My second hypothesis is similar and extends this prediction to physiological well-being. The experimental procedure occurred as follows. Participants were first introduced to the study and agreed to terms and conditions. Next, they practiced taking their heart rate using their fingers or a pulse oximeter, found on most smartwatches or fitness trackers. Then they took the heart rate once more. After this, they used a positive and negative affect schedule, which I will be referring to as PANAS going forward, to record their psychological well-being. Participants were then quasi-randomly split into two leisure task conditions, the scrolling condition and the mindfulness condition. They completed their respective conditional tasks, then retook their heart rate and filled out the PANAS once more afterwards. Finally, they were debriefed and given insight into my experimental study. The experimental study was a randomized single-factor, two-level between-subjects design. In it, the independent variable was the leisure task, and its two levels were the mindfulness condition and the scrolling condition. In the mindfulness condition, participants were tasked with participation in a 10-minute guided body scan meditation led virtually by John Kabat-Zinn. Body scan meditation was chosen as the practice because it incorporates bodily awareness into sessions in addition to mental awareness, which is ideal for my hypotheses. In the scrolling condition, participants were allotted the same 10-minute time period, but were tasked with scrolling through their favorite social media feed during that time. This was done to best simulate sedentary leisure activity during a 10-minute break in one's day, as many people use this time to look through social media. The dependent variables in this study were the psychological and physiological scores, respectively. To determine scores, the post-task score was subtracted from the pre-task score in order to see the effect of the leisure task on the well-being that the test signified. I chose the PANAS because I prioritized generalized or more all-encompassing psychological well-being scores. The way that each test was graded was, each response to a word received a certain amount of points. Positive affect words were graded from 1 to 5, and negative affect words were reverse scored from 5 to 1. So a higher score meant a more positive mood or disposition. The total change in psychological well-being was calculated by subtracting the post-task score from the pre-task one, like I mentioned before. In the graphic below, you can see the point allocation for a positive affect word response and a negative affect word response below it. The physiological test was much simpler in practice. Participants were simply asked to take their heart rate before and after the leisure task, and the change in those scores represented the change in physiological well-being. Participants in my study were recruited primarily from social media, from personal circles, and from the on-campus Earlham community. And the sample age demographic data is indicative that most participants were college-aged. A total of 37 participants filled out the survey in its totality, with 55 additional responses whose data was nullified because they did not sufficiently complete the survey. The lack of participant retention resulted in only 12 participants fully completing the mindful condition, and 25 participants fully completing the scrolling condition, the implications of which I'll discuss later. To ensure reliability of my psychological measurements, I found the Cronbach's alpha of pre- and post-task PANAS, and their overall range lied within the 0.74 to 0.91 range, indicating high reliability. I determined that any lack of reliability for heart rate measure would be due to human error in manually taking one's pulse and did not necessitate statistical analysis. After I recruited all the participants I could, I collected response data and analyzed them. In terms of psychological well-being, we can see from the graph, whose y-axis indicates the decrease in PANAS score from before to after the leisure task, and whose x-axis indicates condition, that participants in the mindfulness condition decreased in well-being more than those in the scrolling condition. If we consult the data, we can see that the mean difference value for the mindful condition is greater in magnitude than the mean difference value for the scrolling condition, consistent with what the graph tells us. The standard error is used for the upper and lower bounds of the error bars, and there's not much variation between conditions for these values. The independent means t-test that I ran tells us that from the negative sign, there's a reversal in the directionality of the effect, meaning that the mindful group experienced a greater average decrease in psychological well-being compared to the scrolling group. Finally, the p-value is much larger than our 0.05 threshold, and we can infer from this that the difference between means failed to reach significance. Moving on to the results from physiological well-being data, we can see from the graph, whose y-axis indicates the increase in heart rate and beats per minute from before to after the leisure task, and whose x-axis indicates condition, that participants in the mindfulness condition experience a lower increase in heart rate compared to participants in the scrolling condition. Consulting the data, we can see that the mean difference value for the scrolling condition is greater in magnitude than the mean difference value for the mindfulness condition. Again, consistent with what the graph says. The standard errors are again used for both bounds of the error bars, and here the standard error values between groups are quite different. In the mindfulness condition, the standard error value is huge, and I attribute this to a large variance within values from participants in the mindful condition, which in turn can come from the very small sample size and from human error in manually recording the pulse, which was done by the majority of participants. The independent means t-test that I ran tells us that again, there's a reversal in the directionality of the effect, meaning that the mindful group experienced a lower average decrease in physiological well-being compared to the scrolling group, which has interesting implications. Looking at the p-value, we can see that the value is more than an order of magnitude larger than our 0.05 threshold, meaning that the difference between means also failed to reach significance. With these results in mind, I can conclusively say that my hypotheses were not supported. Both mindfulness and scrolling conditions led to a decrease in psychological and physiological well-being, with the difference between the two groups being insignificant. These findings are opposite of what I predicted, and I can think of two reasons for this discrepancy. The first is that engaging in a 10-minute mindfulness meditation as a beginner may be more daunting than I anticipated, especially given how little intentional quiet time people normally experience in their everyday lives. Putting participants in this situation may have caused anxiety due to novelty and intimidation in the experience, and caused psychological well-being to decrease as a result. Additionally, the environment in which participants undertook the meditation session could have been loud or distracting, thereby nullifying the anticipated increases in well-being. Limitations of this study were mostly a result of the constraints of the research process. First, the environment in which participants completed the study could not be controlled in a way that maximizes the potential of meditative practice. In the survey, I asked participants in the mindfulness group to find a quiet, comfortable space, but had no way of ensuring that they actually followed this advice, or they dedicated active focus towards the guided meditation the full 10 minutes. The next limitation comes from my participant pool. A small sample size meant that instead of my intended 0.5 effect size with 80% power, which would require 64 participants in each condition, it was impossible to detect any less than a 0.99 effect size with 80% power given my sample size, which is not ideal, to say the least. Adding on to this, a significant confound existed between my groups and my sample, in that there was a lack of internal validity between groups, with more than twice the amount of participants in the scrolling group than there were in the mindfulness group. This means that even if I had found significance in my analysis, it may have been due to the fact that most of those who chose to stay in the mindfulness group could have already been experienced and comfortable with meditation, and the effects would thereby be skewed. For future research, I would suggest adding multiple meditation sessions to the experimental procedure and having testing procedures similar to the ones in my study, before and after each session. This way, data can be taken consistently so that if significance emerges, it can be documented in a temporally precise manner. Second, I would tweak the guided meditation condition to be shorter at the beginning and gradually increased as participants acclimate. I learned from this research that when the environment cannot be controlled, carefully designing an experimental study so that the tendency of the participants is to complete the study all the way through and not abandon it is very important. This could have been done better in my case, with a shorter meditation session potentially increasing participant retention and response output, and I would like to see this implemented in future research. Here's a spicy meme that I made. Here's some references. That's all I have. Thanks for your time, and take some time today to breathe. if not meditate.